Walt Wheeler, Executive Director of the Michigan Masonic Charitable Foundation. We're here today recording another session in the Legacy Series, which is an interview of the past Grand Masters of the Grand Lodge of Michigan. With us here today is Most Worshipful Brother Robert Conley, who served as Grand Master in 2000 and 2001. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you all. Good to be here.
Let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born?
LaPorte, Indiana.
And when
1959.
LaPorte?
54 years ago.
And tell me a little bit about your parents.
Well, my mom was from LaPorte, so that's why we were all delivered there. My sisters, I have 3 sisters, and all of us came from there. My grandma and grandpa at the time lived about 3 doors down from the hospital. So I can't remember the hospital. They tore it down just after I was born, but I still remember grandma's house, and that's where we spent our Sundays when I was a boy.
Okay. So tell me about Mom and Dad.
Mom is still with us. She's 85 today. And as a matter of fact, June 13th is her birthday. And she was from LaPorte. Her mother and father came over from Sweden in the early 1920s, so she's a first-generation American. My dad is from New Buffalo, Michigan, and the differences between them were pretty striking because Dad was about 5 foot nothing, and Mom was much taller. She was over 6 feet. And they got married in 1952, I believe it was. In 1957, he was master of the lodge that I eventually joined. And we all were raised in Harbert, Michigan, which is right on the beach in southwest Michigan. That's where I was raised.
So you were born in LaPorte. When did they come to Michigan?
They actually lived in Michigan at that time.
Oh, and
She just went back to LaPorte to deliver. That's where her doctors were at.
Okay. So you have some siblings. Tell us about your siblings.
I have 3 sisters. Candace is the oldest. She still lives in Harbert, across the street from my mom. My next, and then it's me. Then Susie is married and has 3 kids, lives in Battle Creek with her husband Ken, who is the city engineer for the city of Battle Creek. And my youngest sister Dee Dee, who lives in Ann Arbor, and she has 2 boys, and her husband has Innis Insurance Agency down there.
So tell me, how was it growing up with 3 sisters?
It was horrible. It was terrible. Anything you see about me is because of them. It was certainly different. As a matter of fact, the woman that I'm going out with now is of a family of 1 brother and 3 sisters. So it's kind of funny how it ended up that way again. But I always wanted a younger brother, or an older brother, I suppose, when I was a kid. Growing up, it would have been a lot different. I can assure you that. But I ended up finding a whole bunch of them. So.
So do you have any vivid childhood memories that you want to tell us about, or that you can?
Not particularly. It was different, Obviously, you and I are too close in age not to remember the differences, but our house was a typical 3-bedroom ranch with 1 bathroom and 1 phone on the wall in the kitchen, and dinner was at 6, and Dad worked, and Mom stayed home and took care of the house and the kids, and it was a great life. I don't have any regrets about it. But, it wasn't until I was 18 years old and got out of the house that I actually understood what having a bathroom to yourself meant. So, there were just differences. It was obviously 3 girls, and they ran the house with Mom. And Dad and I were kind of left to our own devices. So we spent a lot of time together when I was growing up. A lot of fishing and a lot of camping. And I think we did that just for our own sanity. So,
where'd you go to school?
Well, obviously right there. And the school system today is called River Valley School District, home of the Mustangs. And I graduated from that in 1977. Although back in that time, and I don't know how it is today, I spent most of probably the last 3 years of school in co-op, half the time working for my dad and then half the time going to school.
And did you particularly have any hobbies or things that you did in high school? Participate in sports, the band?
The only sport I was in was golf. That has not improved. I was in band. up until my sophomore year. Played the trumpet and loved it, loved band very much. But when I went to work, there wasn't a class late enough in the day for me to continue with that. I enjoyed high school for my part of it. I didn't obviously spend a lot of time there, as one might imagine. But back in those days, there was River Valley was well known for its industrial arts class. So I was an aide in the machine shop section of industrial arts, and got an awful lot out of it. Enjoyed it very much. River Valley was and still is a very, very good school.
After high school, did you go to any vocational school or college?
I did not until I was 42. And when I was 42, then I started taking college courses.
Very good. Tell us a little bit about your working life. I know that you had an apprenticeship with your dad. Tell us about that.
I started working for my father when I was 13. He owned an engraving company. And we were engravers of, at that time, jewelry hobs, molds. As a matter of fact, the 60-year pin that the Grand Lodge of Michigan gives out, made by Terry Berry today in Grand Rapids, was the molds for that were actually made by my dad back a long time ago now. And for many years, that was the highest award you could get in Michigan. Nobody really lived past that, so we've done a lot better there. As time went on, it started to diversify quite a bit, and we went into mostly automotive engraving of die-cast dies and plastic injection molds and those kinds of things. And when I was 13, as I mentioned, I started to apprentice for him. When I was 18, I went to work for him full-time. And over the years, I expanded that out. We did everything from those kinds of engravings, industrial engravings, to trophies and awards and that kind of stuff. Sold that business, and then in 1991, I bought the engraving company from Dad, ran it until 2004, and sold it.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about the difference between working for Dad and working for yourself.
You know, I have to tell you, I worked for Dad from the time I was 13 until 1991, so I don't know how many years that would have been, every day. And I can honestly say in that entire period of time, we never once had an argument. We never did. My father wasn't somebody that you would necessarily argue with, because most of the time he was right, so you just kind of learned that at an early age. But I think that that's one of the greatest blessings that I had in that whole period of time. We just had a good time, and he was a great teacher. He was probably one of the finest engravers that I've ever known, and he was really a Renaissance man in the truest sense of the word. Everything fascinated him. Whether it was a mechanical watch or a pocket watch, which he collected and subsequently I took over when he passed away, to motors, to fishing, to everything just fascinated him no end. And he brought a lot of that to the workplace. We had a good time.
That's great. After you sold the engraving business, you actually took on a completely different career.
I did.
And you started doing Masonic renewal for the Grand Lodge of Michigan. Tell us how that came about and how it's evolved.
It was actually a little bit more than just coming to work for Michigan. When I finished as Grand Master in 2001, I was chairman of the Masonic Renewal Committee of North America. And during that time, I was asked to speak and, in some cases, teach all across the United States about strategic planning and conflict resolution and those kinds of things, renewal programs, how to renew a lodge. Much more so than probably anybody had prior to that. I don't really think that there was any movement afoot prior to us in the renewal committee to do those kinds of things. So I was doing a lot of that. And when the opportunity came to sell the business, I decided that I would, and that I would move then full-time into that occupation, which I did. And somewhere inside of that time, I put together a 5-year plan for the Grand Lodge of Michigan. And I know you were there at the time. And it was really a comprehensive perspective of the reality of the craft in Michigan and the vision of where it could be. So the first part of it was to look at everything from the fraternity's perspective. How did our buildings look? What was their condition? How many members did we have? Where? How active were lodges? What was the impact that it was having on the community? Once we figured that out, then get the lodges active and motivated, and then start to build a public relations program, which we did, and just a great many other components of that plan. And part of it was that it needed somebody to run it full time. And the Grand Lodge of Michigan hired me to run that program, that 5-year plan, which we did.
And that actually evolved into something more, which you're even doing today, taking on basically the operation of the entire Grand Lodge office. Tell us how that emerged, and tell us about your day-to-day activities in the Grand Lodge office.
Sure. During the 5-year plan, so I think probably in about the 5th year of it, I started working up here in Alma, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. Took an apartment in Lansing and started to commute back and forth, and eventually my presence up here just became that I had an office up here and our officers here, and worked 5 days a week here. Some point in time, I can't recall when, Mr. Stevens, Bob Stevens, decided that he would retire as business manager, and in a move to continue the operations of the office without any breaks in it, and as a cost-saving measure as well, we just decided that those responsibilities of his office would be moved over onto my desk. So that's how I became kind of the day-to-day operations person here at the office, although that really is not my job. My job is still Director of Member Services, and that's what I try to focus most of my energies on. So on a day-to-day basis, I'm up here all the time. I sold my place down in Harbert in 2000 and must have been 9, and moved up here into St. John's, where I'm very happy. Plural member in St. John's Lodge now.
Very good.
They're doing great stuff.
And tell us about some of the organizations that you belong to, not Masonic, but some of the other groups that you've been involved with. Toastmasters.
Yeah, I think I've probably been involved with most of them. I've been an elk, been a moose, been currently Rotarian here at the St. Louis Alma Rotary Club that meets in the home on Tuesdays, and enjoy that very much. I've been a Jaycee, been a Toastmaster. Toastmasters was a wonderful organization. I enjoyed that very much. Currently, I'm in the BMW Car Club, which I enjoy very much. We have a lot of road rallies and those kinds of things that are very different from my Masonic life, but I enjoy them very much. And then other appendant bodies of Masonry that I'm very involved in.
Tell me a little bit about, because I'm not a member of any of those other fraternal organizations especially, how do those differ from Masonry, like Elks or Moose? There's got to be similarities, but what are the differences?
Well, there are similarities in that they're fraternal. However, and it's very hard to put into words the differences between them, but they are not Masonry, no matter what they might like to believe. There is a difference between the Masonic institution and those other clubs and groups. And again, I've been a member and am a member and enjoy all of them very much. But the difference is between them and us, or Masonry, that in Masonry there is a shared experience. The ceremony, the ritualistic component of Freemasonry is missing in those other organizations. In Freemasonry, you make a Mason. In the other groups, you join the club. And then the difference is subtle, but it's very powerful. I am a Mason. I belong to Rotary. I am a Mason, but I belong to the Lions Club. And that's a big difference in the way that I view my world and the way that I relate to those other organizations.
How did you Well, actually, I know the answer to this, but how did you first learn of the Masonic fraternity?
A good friend of mine and I, who did join the craft, were watching The Man Who Would Be King with Sean Connery and Michael Caine. And Danny said to me after the movie, "Boy, I think it'd be neat to be a Mason." And I said, "I think my dad's a Mason." And the next day I went to work and I said, "Are you a Mason?" And before I could blink, I had a petition in my hand and a check for $40. So that's how I joined.
So he'd never talked about the fraternity prior to that?
No. I didn't. I knew that he was, but I didn't. He never really verbalized it. We knew that Monday night was lodge night, and that he wouldn't be home for dinner, and that he would probably be coming home a little late. Back in those days, at my lodge, they played euchre, and they played it into the wee hours. So that's kind of what they did.
What lodge did you join?
Three Oaks, number 239.
And when was that?
May 10th, 1982.
1982.
Yeah.
You got involved in the lodge and got active,
Mm-hmm.
went through the officer line, became Worshipful Master. Any recollections of that time period, being master of the lodge and a young master?
Oh yeah, it was great, and it's hard to believe, And I know that you do the same thing when you go back and look at those pictures, and you can't imagine that you were that young once. And it was 1987 when I was Worshipful Master of the lodge. I went right into the chairs. I didn't even have a chance to sit on the sidelines. And I can say that since that time, I've never really sat on the side. I've always had some task, some responsibility in the lodge. When I was Worshipful Master of the lodge, we really started to open the building up a lot more than it had been in the past. And it was right in that period of time when Freemasonry was starting to realize that the decline that it had been going through since 1959 was starting to have a much more detrimental impact on the local lodge rather than simply just a decline of numbers. So my lodge, when I was installed, it was the first public installation that Three Oaks Lodge had ever had. Prior to that, they just didn't do it. And we had about 150 people in that lodge room, and I know you've been there, so we had a lot of people crammed into it. And to this day, we've always had a public installation. It's always been the same. But we had a great time. My first Grand Lodge session, though, was 2 weeks after I was raised. I went to Grand Lodge in Detroit at the Big Temple. And I think that for somebody coming into the craft that young and really never being exposed to the fraternity to walk into the Detroit Masonic Temple, that's something impressive. So,
and whose session was that?
I think it was Russ Wells. I'm not exactly sure. I can't remember. I know he was there, so I'm going to leave it at that.
Why did you go, being 2 weeks after your race, why did you go to
the Worshipful Master was terrified to drive to the city of Detroit. And I said, well, I don't mind. So that's what I did. That's how I got to go.
Very good. I know that you've always enjoyed the ritual. You're an excellent ritualist. I think you actually were elected by your district as a DDI.
I was. That must have been about 1989, I think.
And any recollections of that experience, being young? Because you were very young.
I was. And my recollections of it were that there were a lot of men in that district who weren't very happy with that. At that time, one of the lodges to the north of mine was very strong, and all of the officers of the district came out of that lodge. So when one of the southern lodges took it, that was a bit of a shock to them. But we worked. I went out and rattled the bushes, and we got our past masters and officers to go to that election, and we won. And I was very happy being a district deputy instructor. Enjoyed that very much. About 1 or 2 years into that, there was a vacancy in the Board of General Purposes office, and I ran for that election and was elected to that, and that's how I came into that position. I would have to say that of all the positions that I've held in the craft, my favorite was Board of General Purposes.
Really? Mm-hmm. Okay. Why?
Because it's there that you can have the most profound impact on those lodges. You don't have a lot of them. At that time, it was District 10A and B, and it had 18 lodges in it when I was BGP. And there was nothing that I loved more than going to those lodges and talking with them and getting them involved in programs. There was so much new stuff that was happening at that time. It was really an exciting time to be a new, young, active guy. I'm a little older now. I'm not quite as quick as I used to be.
I understand. You belong to some of the appendant and affiliated organizations. Tell us about some of the organizations you belong to.
Well, I think I belong to, again, just about all of the more commonly known. I joined Scottish Rite in 1983 or 4 in the Valley of Grand Rapids in October, and that was just a real powerful event for me. Was very active in it for many years on the stage crew. Was very active. There used to be the South Berrien County Scottish Rite Club, and we did the 9th degree and the 13th degree, as I recall, and enjoyed that very much. So I have always enjoyed Scottish Rite very much. I joined Royal Arch, Council, and Commandery, but I've never been active in it. At the time that I joined those groups down in Niles, they meet on Friday nights, or did. And when I was that age, the last thing I wanted to do on a Friday night was go to a potluck. So I was never active with the York Rite, but I've always enjoyed my membership with it as much as I can, and still maintain it.
I know you're involved with the Shrine and some of the.
I'm not an active Shriner, though. I did join the Shrine. I'm much more active with. I'm an associate member in Ahmed Temple up in Marquette. I'm actually more active with them than I am with Saladin, which is my mother temple. I try to stay in touch with them and keep abreast. I was very fortunate for a lot of years to be on the Imperial Shrine's membership committee and on their leadership committee and on their program and planning committee, and was very active with them for a long time. And got off of those about 2 or 3 years ago now, I guess it was. So my involvement with the Shrine was always at a much larger level than with the individual temples.
Of the, and I think I know the answer to this too, of the appendant organizations, which would you say is your favorite?
Oh, Scottish Rite, without a doubt. Yeah, I've always enjoyed Scottish Rite. And I enjoyed very much being active in it. I won't say that I was a very good actor. I don't look at Scottish Rite as ritual. I look at it as acting. And I wasn't a really good actor. But I loved being on a stage crew, and I still do. Kind of the grease paint part of the rite. And I love the Valley of Grand Rapids. It's history. I like being there. I like being part of it. I remember when the light board was still the gigantic throw the big levers, and when we had the whole building. I was there when the whole building was a Masonic temple, and of course today a lot of it's rented out to the public. But certainly one of the high points of my adult life, not even my Masonic life, just my adult life, was when I was nominated to receive the 33rd, and when the Valley honored me with the Meritorious Service Award as well. Both of them are, to me, very powerful. And I'm very honored.
You also served as Commander-in-Chief in the Valley of Grand Rapids.
Commander-in-Chief in the last term, so that would have been now 2 years ago, I guess. Enjoyed that very much. That was just a great time. I wish that I was closer to 233 East Fulton, to where I could participate a lot more. But I'm always available to the Rite. I've loved Scottish Rite. I find nothing wanting in it.
You've received many honors and awards over the years. What are a couple of the ones that are the most memorable, had the most impact on you?
I don't know if I could really even say. I remember back when I was Grand Master, we partnered with Three Oaks Elementary, and I was a tutor down there. And and the lodge and the brothers in there had been very active in that school and done a lot of good stuff in there. And that year I was given the golden acorn, and I have a little lapel pin that's an acorn, and obviously 3 Oaks pin. So, you know, that has always meant a great deal to me. I have a lot of honorary memberships in lodges, and those have always meant a lot. Obviously, the 33rd was a powerful award that was given. And it was given to me by Bob Osborne. At that time, Robert was the one who was deputy for Michigan, and so that was very special to me. But all of them, you know, whether it was any of those or the Meritorious Service Award, even the Loyal Service Award, has to me been something that I've cherished. So any time that I receive a recognition, it's always something that I treasure very much. I know that a lot of people who should get them don't necessarily, and so for them, I'm very thankful.
You mentioned Bob Osborne. Who were some of the other older past Grand Masters that you knew personally? When I say older, I meant maybe prior to your time.
Well, certainly Royce Curlis. I don't think Royce liked me very much, but then again, he didn't like many people. So I knew Royce, and I thought very highly of him. He was up here when he passed away at the home, and so I had the opportunity to see him a few times before he passed on. The men that I knew when I came into line, Dale Edwards and Don Reno, those guys are still very prominent in my thoughts. John Polson, obviously, you know, thankfully still with us. And I can remember when John would come up to the podium, and the whole Grand Lodge session would go to a hush the minute that John would just walk up to the podium. That's how highly they thought of him. I certainly remember Carl Warfel in Grand Rapids. I don't recall Newt Bacon, but he obviously was a big power down in the world that I came from, down in Niles. Bob Sanborn, you know, those men are in my memory, even though some are still with us, the icons of Grandmasters past.
Who were some of your Masonic mentors?
Well, certainly, I couldn't even go any further without saying Don Boyer. Don was the man who appointed me into the line as Grand Lecturer. He was the man who encouraged me to become Board of General Purposes representative for that district. But beyond that, even when I was junior deacon, and I still can remember it like it was yesterday, I was absolutely terrified. The lodge was packed. I was junior deacon. The master called me up to tile the lodge, and I gave a sign that included all 3. And when Don brought remarks afterwards, he said, I think we better keep an eye on that kid. He's trying to rewrite the ritual already. But I had talked with Dad about who he was. I didn't know who he was, obviously, but my dad held him in very high regard. Don's been a mentor for me all those years and still is. And the other week when we gave him his 50-year award, if we just looked at who was up there giving that to him, I think that impact that he's had on an awful lot of people just proves that you never really know what kind of fruit you're going to grow from the seeds you plant. So Don has certainly been one. Bob Osborne was a great mentor for me. Certainly John Polson was and has been over the years. My father, and men who left us too quickly. An old friend, Bob McClellan, who passed away before he was able to become Grand Master. Those names, and the older we get, we kind of reflect back on how much impact they had on us. So for certainly too many to name, but those stick out of my mind.
What actually, tell us how you ended up getting into Grand Lodge.
When Don Boyer was Grand Master, the Grand Lecturer resigned for personal reasons, and we were we were here in Elma. It would have been in August. I can't remember the date, but when they used to have the Masonic and Eastern Star Fair, and then we'd have a parade. And at that time, my wife and I were up here in the parade with a little pink Geo tracker that my dad owned, but it was a convertible, so we were in the parade. And Don asked me in the morning before the parade if I would consider becoming Grand Lecturer to fill that vacancy. And he said, "You don't need to answer me now. Be sure and talk with Julie about it and make your decision." And so that's how I got into the line. It was a big decision. I think I was 32 at the time, so I wasn't certainly very old. I think that was certainly the youngest Grand Lecturer in Michigan Freemasonry. But that's how I got into the line. The next year, I was elected to that position, and that was Don Reno's Masonic year. And in his year, the marshal at that time resigned for personal reasons. And Don asked me if I would consider becoming Grand Marshal. And I did, and ran for election and was subsequently elected. There were 2 vacancies in the line, so I went to Junior Grand Deacon. And Bob McClellan became Grand Marshal.
Once you moved into the progressive line, tell us about some of your experiences as you went through that line. What were some of your most vivid memories of being a Grand Lodge officer?
Well, then I think there was a lot more distinction between the different officers. The junior officers were really not involved at any high level with the board of directors, and so when we were called to something, it was usually for a dedication or other kinds of ceremonies like that. I remember we dedicated a historic monument marker in Rochester in July in a valley, and it was 105 out and humid at least 100%. It was terrible, and we were in those morning suits. And I know that you remember me in that morning suit. I hated it with every inch, and for the audience, it's a wool, very thick, very heavy tuxedo kind of a suit, and I thought we were going to lose everybody at that one. But my years of being in the line, to the extent that I was always there up through Don Boyer's year, we rode together and traveled everywhere together, and his wife Jo would always make popcorn and have a cooler with sodas and stuff in it, so it was always fun, and there were a lot of people going to a lot of different places. And then when I became Grand Master, Don was Grand Secretary, so we got to share that again, and that's always been very good memories of mine. We had a wonderful Grand Line when I was Grand Master, and of course you were Grand Marshal, the best Grand Marshal I ever had. And but we had a great year. I think we did a lot of things, a lot of new things, and set the course of the craft for the next many years to come because of what took place then.
Let's talk about your year as Grand Master. You started the Beacon Project. Why don't we talk a little bit about the Beacon Project? Where did you get that idea, and how did that evolve?
The Beacon Project came out of an understanding that men need to feel part of something bigger than themselves, and they need to have an impact on their community in a way that makes a difference. Giving money is fine, and it's a good thing, and it needs to occur. But giving of your time is something that I think is much more important and much more valuable to these places. So then you start asking yourself, what kind of a program would we do then? Knowing that we don't have a lot of money, we don't have a lot of time, but what time we can give, where can we give that in a way that makes the most difference in the lives of people? And out of that thought and that process came the Beacon Project, where we had at that time pledged to give 200,000 volunteer hours to the elementary schools in Michigan. we didn't make it in 1 year, but we did make it, and we actually surpassed it. And today, by the counts that I've gotten, we're well over 400,000 hours that the Michigan Masons and their families have given to the elementary schools in the state. That certainly was and always will be the high point of my year as Grand Master. Just seeing the impact that so many people had on so many lives of kids that might not have been able to read had they not had that tutor. And still today, there's still a lot of lodges and a lot of Masons and their families that are giving still time to tutor and to help kids through those years. And I think in today's world, the schools in Michigan need them more desperately than they did even then. So I still think that it was a valuable thing to do. And meeting the governor and making that pledge to him at that time was John Engler, and that was neat. We got a lot of press out of it.
Yes, we did.
So no, it was a good program. That was certainly a high point. Grand Lodge session up at Grand Traverse Resort was great, and I'll never forget that. It was an exciting time, and it set the stage for my life since then. So for the 10 or 11 years that I've been out of office, all of this is because of what happened there.
You also hold a distinction that few get to do. You served as chairman of the Conference of Grand Masters of North America.
I was.
Tell us a little bit about that experience and how...
I was nominated for that and elected in Savannah, Georgia, the year prior to my serving. I was conference chairman in Phoenix. And
for our viewers, why don't you tell them a little bit about what the conference is?
The conference is composed of the 64 jurisdictions in North America. And the jurisdictions are each of the individual Grand Lodges, plus all of those in the provinces of Canada, York, Mexico, and I think that that's it. And it is a place where Grand Masters and others have an opportunity to discuss Masonic issues relevant at that period of time. And there are also ad hoc groupings that come out of it. The Masonic Renewal Committee, which I was very active in, and still am, is a subgroup of the Conference of Grand Masters that meets at their will and pleasure, as is the National Masonic Foundation for Children, or at least it was. The George Washington Masonic Memorial Association has its annual meeting at the same time as the Conference of Grand Masters, and the Masonic Service Association also has its annual meeting at that conference. So it is a place where, even though we're all individual and independent Grand Lodges, once a year they all get together and try to work out, or at least develop a kind of a process where they can all talk about the things that are important to them happening to the totality of North American Freemasonry. At that time, at that year in Phoenix in 2001, when I was conference chairman, it was the first gathering after Imperial Shrine had met and removed the requisite of Scottish Rite or York Rite membership in order to become a Shriner. So at that point in time, that was a big issue. It caused a lot of consternation amongst the fraternity, not only craft masonry and the appendant bodies, but also amongst the Shrine itself. And so that afternoon, we had a round table discussion with the Imperial Potentate at that time, who it was, it escapes me now at the moment, but as well as the heads of the appendant bodies and the other Grand Masters that were involved in that. I don't know that anything came out of it, but it was interesting to have, and it was certainly an enjoyable time to be conference chairman. I don't think Michigan has had anyone since. Although Michigan has been very well represented on those national committees, and is, again, today with our current Grand Master, with Ray Lemons, now serving on the Committee for Information and Recognition. And he'll be on that for 7 years, the good Lord willing. So.
Very good. You had mentioned Masonic renewal, and we've talked about that a little bit. And that's always been a passion of yours. And I know you started that way back.
Way back, yeah.
So how did how did all that start? How did that become your passion? And tell us a little bit about how that evolved. And you've been involved with that for 20 plus years now.
Yeah. Was first exposed to even that concept in 1989. I went to a seminar in Detroit at the Big Temple, Scottish Rite Cathedral. I still remember it. And there was a presentation being delivered by a man named Dudley Davis. Dudley became a very vocal proponent of Masonic renewal, taught a lot of classes here in Michigan, and was a great mentor of mine for many years. And what he did was pull together a whole sequence of events in a way that then you could look at and say, I understand. And one of those was that for every year up to that point in time, so that was 1989, for 30 years at that point in time, we've been losing 3.5% to 4% of our membership every year, every single year. And what I realized at that point was that when I went back to my business had been losing exactly the same thing. You just don't see it. And you adjust your prices and you might find another customer, but in essence, we were losing 3.5% to 4% every year. The reasons why in my business are not important, but what is important is that when you look at something, you have to see it for what it is, not for what you hope or wish it would be. And Masonic renewal became that thing, that you have to look at it from a distance and say, all right, what are we doing, and is it the right thing to do at this point in time? Then, as now, Freemasonry can be a very backwards-looking group. We tend to look to the glories of the past, to when there were 500,000 Shriners marching down the streets of Detroit, or when there were 36 lodges that met in the Detroit Masonic Temple, or when the entire building in Grand Rapids was a Masonic lodge. But those days are gone. And it doesn't mean they can't come back, but it just means that if you spend all your time looking at what was, you'll never see what can be. So Masonic renewal became, for me, the springboard that allowed me to look forward in a way with people who are also trying to do the same thing. And so you found great men of Masonry at that time, all across the United States, that became very involved in that process. Francis Paul from the Scottish Rite was passionate about Masonic renewal. Jack Jones, who's still a great friend and mentor of mine from the Shrine, became a big proponent, still is, of those kinds of initiatives. Masonic renewal was never trying to destroy Freemasonry. It was trying to say that you have to be relevant to the people who are joining or who will join. And if you are, then they'll join and they'll stay. And if you're not, then if they do join, they won't stay, and the odds are they're going to tell other people on their way out the door. So it becomes kind of the Montgomery Ward scenario. So I'm still very active in Masonic renewal. And it's because it does have a forward focus.
How has renewal evolved since your first introduction into it in the early 90s to today? How it's evolved as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think today it has become more of an understood practice. It doesn't mean that, and it met with tremendous resistance. Even the simplest concepts met with unbelievable resistance. When you tell a lodge that what we'd like you to do is just to try round tables so that everybody's actually facing each other, you wouldn't believe the kinds of static that we'd get. And today, in most lodges in the state of Michigan, you'll find round tables. But for many, it became that the ritual, that we were saying the ritual needed to go away. And obviously, from my perspective, that it couldn't be anything further from the truth. But a lot of Masons have a hard time making a distinguishment between what they enjoy and what they find relevance in, and what somebody coming into the craft might not understand and might not enjoy, and that we have to find something for them as well. There has to be some pertinent reason that they find value in the craft. Masonic renewal evolved to where it had fulfilled its purpose. Its original purpose was to identify those things that are causing people to leave, identify those things that could cause them to come, and then make that presence known to the craft in the United States and Canada. And we did that. And there were books and videos and all kinds of programs and products, speeches, lectures, symposiums, and all these things on Masonic renewal. And a lot of that took place. Like anything else, it lost a lot of steam. We're working now to bring it back to a place of prominence inside of the craft, and as a resource center for programs of mentoring and leadership skills development and those kinds of things that all Masons need, but that lodges most certainly need some assistance in.
You serve on the executive board of the George Washington Masonic Memorial, and I know you're very excited about that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the memorial and how you got that job?
That's one of those where it's always best to bring volunteers on who have specific skill sets. I had helped them with their strategic plan, and when they offered to pay me for it, I said just donate it back to the organization and don't worry about the money. And after that, they asked me to serve on the board. So, and I did, and those terms are for 3 years, and or at that time, now there are 2, but I served on that board for 3 years, and then they asked me to go on the executive committee, and that's another 6 years, I believe it is. And I did. I absolutely love serving on that board. The George Washington Masonic Memorial is the only edifice in the United States that is owned by every jurisdiction in the United States, and that is the one thing that all of us have in common. Everybody owns it. It's a public place, but it's owned by Masons, and it demonstrates to me something that I feel very passionately about, and that is that all men need heroes. And it really doesn't matter how old you get. You need people that you can look to when times are tough or when you're wondering what should I do next, that have been there and done that. And to me, George Washington has always been one of those icons of virtue that we could all look up to. Certainly has brought me into contact with other great people all across the United States. We've had representatives since I've been there from every jurisdiction in the country. Today we're very fortunate. We have a wonderful brother from Puerto Rico that's on there now, on our board, and is just doing some great stuff there. Its outreach continues. Been very involved in getting not only the understanding that the memorial, the building itself, is important and needs to be maintained in such a way that demonstrates Masons all across the country are esteemed for him, but also that the public needs to be informed and educated that George Washington was a Mason, and that a great many of his ideals and virtues come directly from us, that they were reinforced because he was a Mason. It wasn't just kind of an ancillary thing that he belonged to. Certainly in those days, it was the only other thing to belong to. So I'm very pleased to be on that board and enjoy it very much.
Very good. What do you think the fraternity needs to grow and prosper? I know this is another thing that you're passionate about, and it's part of the whole renewal process. But if you could narrow it down to a couple of sound bites.
I don't know about the sound bite. It needs a couple things. I think most importantly, it needs hope. It needs to believe in itself, in the power that it has to change men's lives for the good. The man I am today is a direct result of Freemasonry, and the man that I was when I joined it. These two things are very different from each other, and you can't separate me from the craft. I am as much a piece of it as any man who's ever held it as his own. But when I go to lodges today, and you and I, more so than most, go to lodge all the time, someplace, I see far too often a simple lack of hope. But there is no hope for the future. Their optimism is gone. So then I spend my time, I believe, in reaffirming that there is hope for the future, that there is optimism, that tomorrow will be better than it was today. That's my passion. That's what I want to do. The craft has it hard. That's okay. It's always had it hard. We've never had an easy road. the anti-Masonic movement was here, and we lived through it. And it was lived through by a lodge in Michigan. And so from that perspective, I want my membership coming into this craft, I want the membership that's here to know that tomorrow will be brighter because you're a Mason today. And the second thing that it needs, I think even more so desperately than that, is an understanding that our older brothers, whatever that might imply, whether it's my age or somebody older than me, needs to become a mentor to the new men who come in through its doors. They need to give them the wisdom of Masonry. They need to provide them with brotherhood and fellowship. They need to be that foundation that gives them support. And when they're trying to do something new or different or exciting inside of a lodge, and the lodge is scared to try it. But if some of the older brothers will say, it's okay, let's try that, whatever it might be. And those older men have lived through bad times, and they're still here, and they're with us today, and they can prove that hope does always come out on top. So those two things, the hopefulness of tomorrow that it will be better than it is today, and their need then to become mentors to the new men who come into the fraternity. I believe if we do those two things, and we do them well, even if we do them poorly, we'll still be better off than we are right now. There was a day that I was the kid being mentored by great men. And those men didn't see themselves as being great. They were just men. They were Masons. They were people who were doing their thing. And out of that experience comes me in my place today. Now it's up to me to become that mentor to those new men who come into the craft today. And in 30 years, they'll be talking about us. We'll probably be sitting out on the porch at home.
Sure, you're right.
So that's
What would you tell somebody that was thinking about becoming a Freemason?
Do it. But take your time. Investigate it. Consider it. Find somebody in your life that has an impact in that lodge that's a part of it. How blessed were we that our fathers were in it already. We had a built-in mentor, right? But I too many young men coming into the craft today don't. So, but if you want your life forever changed, come into it and become part of it. Be active in it. My lodge back in those days when I joined, it didn't meet every night. It didn't even meet 4 times a month. It met once a month, and maybe one other night if it had work. And so I started cleaning the lodge. And so I was up there every week. And I was mopping the floor and vacuuming the carpets and cleaning. And I got to know every inch of that building. And I got to investigate, the old minute books and the old registers of people that had come from back in the 1860s when the lodge was chartered. And so if it's not active, make it active. Become somebody who just is there, and I guarantee you'll find it's a world of experience here, right? I mean, we've traveled around the world. We've been to Europe and Great Britain as Masons, and I wouldn't travel any other way. We have friends all around the world. It is a life-changing, life-enriching experience. I highly recommend it to everybody.
I agree. What would you tell somebody that was just going to become Worshipful Master of their lodge? What advice would you give them to have a successful year?
Oh, set the craft at work. Not necessarily ritualistically, as important as that is. But set the craft at work. Be a leader. One of our lodges this year that won the Twain Award, if you ask them what do they do, Masonically, they really don't do that much. But in that community, they are everything. If you need a place to hold an event, the lodge is open. If you need a group to help you clean up the park, the lodge is available. If you need anything that lodge can provide you with, that lodge is available. All of that. Now, that's the whole lodge, but it's led by the master, and he's just done an incredible job. And I could give you dozens of illustrations of that. lodges inside of communities that are very active because the Worshipful Master sets the pace. And if he's active, and if he's vibrant, and if he's hope-filled, and if he's mentoring his people, that lodge is going to grow and prosper and have a great year, and it will continue on. All of it comes from the master. I can't tell you how many masters I've talked to over the years that said, I'm tired. Well, you know what? You can lay down when you're dead. In the meantime, get to work. Set your craft at work. You bet. I think that's good advice.
What would you tell somebody that was considering running for Grand Lodge? It's a completely different job altogether.
Yeah, and that one I'd think real hard. I mean, are you willing, on the one hand, to give up a lot of freedom, a lot of ability to have a Saturday at home, a lot of ability not to drive in blizzards and nasty weather? Are you willing to give that up? Being a Grand Lodge officer means that you're no longer a member of your lodge. You are a member of every lodge. It means that you don't have the liberty of privacy, that you've become now accessible to everybody, that their problems are yours. Are you willing to assume those responsibilities? All of that on the one hand. And on the other hand is really a life of service. There are no benefits over here. There are no perks. There are no advantages in being a Grand Lodge officer. Quite to the contrary. Those things become nothing more than your ability to say, I will be of service to you. And if that's what you want to do, then I want you to be a Grand Lodge officer. But if you're not willing to do that, and you're not willing to give this stuff up, don't do it. You'll find it a very difficult life. It's not an easy one. Your wife, significant other, however you want to look at that, is not going to see you as much as she does now or would like to. So it's as much her decision as it is yours. But having said all of that, the finest thing that ever happened to me was when I was appointed into line, when I served as Grand Master. And my life ever since then has been a wondrous journey. It's been a wonderful thing. I have no regrets, none. And gave up all of those things for the one. And I hope that I've been a good servant. I guess at the end of the day, that's what I hope.
I agree. How has Masonry impacted your life?
Well, as we mentioned when we started, you can't really separate the me today from the craft. I don't think, with the exception of very few people that come to mind, all long since gone, that somebody's life has been so profoundly changed in its direction, and then where your livelihood becomes your passion, becomes your love. You know, so today I work for the Grand Lodge of Michigan, and I have to pinch myself sometimes. Never would have even dreamed that was a possibility. I was Grand Master. I never would have even imagined that would have happened. I was conference chairman of the Conference of Grand Masters of North America. Who would have even thought? You know, I come from Harbert, Michigan. This is not a big community. And my lodge is Three Oaks Lodge, and it's never had more than 120 members in it. So how hasn't it changed? And again, I don't think that there's any part of me that is who that kid was, in 1982 when he was raised. And nobody, then my father most especially, would have even imagined that someday I'd be sitting here being interviewed by you.
I know what you mean. Well, Bob, we'd like to thank you very much for participating in the Foundation's Oral History program. I'd like to personally thank you for everything that you do for the fraternity. I consider you one of my Masonic mentors and a great friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. My pleasure.